Putin escalates the war and creates chaos at the NATO summit by launching a new heavy offensive against Ukraine right on the eve of the alliance leaders meeting in Ankara, Turkey. In the early hours of July 6, 2026, missiles and drones struck, buildings were hit in Kyiv, and the political message was clear. Moscow wants to get a seat at the international table by creating fear, pressure, and urgency. While NATO prepares to discuss defense, military spending, weapons production, and support for Ukraine, Putin tries to show that he can still set the European board on fire with long-range attacks. The main target was Kyiv and the region around the Ukrainian capital, but the effect was much greater. Poland activated its military aviation as a precaution, Europe started talking about air defense again, Zelensky demanded Patriot missiles that cannot remain idle in warehouses, and Donald Trump. He arrives at the summit pressured to turn the promise of peace into a real decision. This is the point where the war stops being just a tragedy on the front lines and becomes a direct demand within NATO. What does Putin want to hide? Why did he attack now? How will NATO respond? I'll tell you all about this in a moment. If you like this kind of straightforward and no-nonsense content, consider subscribing because we have videos like this every day. Russia launched a wave of missile attacks in the early hours of Monday. Missiles and drones targeted Kyiv and other areas of Ukraine. According to Ukrainian authorities and international media, dozens of missiles and hundreds of drones were used in an offensive that killed at least 22 people and left dozens injured. The Ukrainian capital was the main target, with residential buildings damaged, rescue teams working in the rubble, and residents evacuated from areas at risk of further violence. The attack happened just a few hours before the NATO summit scheduled for July 7 and 8, 2026 in Ankara. The timing does not seem to be a coincidence. Putin pulled the political trigger before the meeting to try to force his way into the debate by playing on fear. While leaders of 32 NATO nations were preparing to discuss defense, the military industry, and Ukraine, Moscow thrust the most sensitive issue to the forefront: the lack of sufficient air defense to protect Ukrainian cities against ballistic missiles. The Ukrainian Air Force reported that Russia used 351 drones and 68 missiles in the attack. The most serious detail concerns the ballistic missiles. All 29 missiles of this type hit their targets precisely because Ukraine does not have enough interceptors to shoot down this type of threat. The Ukrainians are able to shoot down many drones and some of the cruise missiles, but the ballistic ones require more advanced systems, especially the Patriot systems made by the United States. Patriot missiles need to be in Ukraine's defense units, not stored in warehouses. The pressure is directed at the United States and also at Europe. Ukraine knows that without these interceptors, Putin will keep using ballistic missiles to hit major cities, cause deaths, and force the population to live under constant alert. For Kyiv, every delay in this delivery means loss of lives. Poland also went on alert during the Russian offensive. The Polish military command reported that due to the activity of Russian long-range aviation against Ukraine, military aircraft were deployed in Polish airspace and ground air defense systems were put on alert. The measure was preventive, but it shows the extent of the risk. When Russia attacks Ukraine near NATO's eastern border, the fear of mistakes, provocations, or airspace violations immediately returns to the center of the crisis. This warning carries weight because Poland is a member of NATO and the European Union. Any incident involving its territory could push the alliance into even more serious tension with Moscow. Putin is trying to do this exactly when NATO is discussing how to split the bill for its own defense. Donald Trump arrives at the meeting in Ankara demanding that European allies spend more and take more responsibility for the continent's security. The pressure from the United States on alliance members has a concrete point. You can't depend on Washington forever while Russia keeps stepping up the pace. China is watching, the Middle East is boiling, and Europe is still debating the budget as if the danger were distant. NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte demanded clear, concrete, and credible plans for the allies to meet defense investment targets. The goal being discussed is to reach 5% of GDP in defense. Those who don't invest in defense end up depending on the goodwill of another government when a crisis comes. The meeting in Ankara is also expected to reaffirm military support for Ukraine. The expectation is that allies will pledge around 70 billion euros in equipment, assistance and training for 2026 without a direct contribution from the United States in this package. Trump wants Europe to pay more, produce more, and take on its own share of the war. Ukraine wants this money to become weapons, air defense, and ammunition at the right time. Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, also weighed in on the matter and said that Ukraine urgently needs more air defense systems. She stated that this topic will be discussed at the Ankara summit. The European Union also announced transfers as part of a larger support package, including resources for purchasing drones produced in Ukraine itself. Moscow accuses Ukraine of attacking Russian infrastructure and uses this to justify new retaliations. But the political difference is clear. Russia invaded Ukraine, keeps the war going, and now tries to sell its offensives as a response to suas ofensivas como resposta necessária. Moscow stated that its targets were military facilities, weapons factories, energy facilities, and sites used for air defense repair. But the damage to residential buildings in Kyiv once again exposed the old Russian contradiction. The Kremlin says it was targeting a military site, but what the footage shows is frightened residents, destroyed apartments, and emergency teams trying to find survivors. This is the hallmark of Putin's war, calling what hits families sleeping in their homes a strategic operation. Trump also gets involved in this story with his own pressure. He has already said that he wanted to end the war quickly, but reality hits much harder in Ankara. Putin doesn't seem to be backing down just because of talk. He uses attack, attrition, and fear to negotiate from a position of advantage. Zelensky is expected to meet with Trump during the summit and will likely put on the table the issue of Patriot interceptors, air defense, and the need to put more pressure on Moscow. Turkey is hosting the summit at a delicate moment. Ankara wants to show strength within NATO, expand defense cooperation, and push for fewer trade restrictions in the military sector. Erdogan is also trying to improve dialogue with Washington and bring sensitive issues back to the table. Meanwhile, the war in Ukraine is pushing all leaders toward an issue that cannot be handled with diplomatic rhetoric. Russia is testing the real capacity of the alliance. That's the heart of the problem. If Ukraine needs interceptors and they don't arrive, if Europe promises ammunition and takes too long, if Patriot systems exist but are held up by political decisions, Putin gains time. And time in this war turns into cities being hit, weakened defenses, and people living under sirens. Zelensky's response was built on this sense of urgency. He warned that Russia is preparing new attacks and that any delay in sending air defense missiles encourages Moscow to continue. Moscow increasingly relies on waves of missiles, drones, and psychological terror because it cannot turn the war into a clear victory on the political front. The summit begins under intense pressure. Either NATO speeds up its response or Putin will continue to use every international meeting as a stage to increase chaos. Thank you very much for watching this video until the end. Support our project and contribute financially through the Pix key that appears on your screen. We are an independent channel focused on bringing you the truth. Your contribution helps us keep going.